ELS 232, African Poetry. This class is recorded live on YouTube. We are two lecturers on the course, my humble self and Dr. Okofafran. And as I said, the class is being recorded, so after the class you can go on YouTube and can find the recording there. So we want to begin by looking at the definition and conceptual issues in African poetry. The definition and conceptual issues in African poetry. African poetry is one of the genres of literature in Africa. So we also have African prose and African drama. What sets it apart from any other regional literature is the word African, which is a qualifier in the expression African poetry. So that qualifier is very important because it is an identity mark. And so when you talk about African poetry, you need to justify why it is African. What makes it African? What sets it aside from, say, American poetry, English poetry, Caribbean poetry, and so on and so forth. So it's important for you to understand that marker, African, that qualifier African in African poetry. Because then we're looking at what is distinctively African in the poems we study. So there's an identity mark there for you to consider. First, it is that this poetry is written by Africans. Second, and most importantly, it is that this poetry is about Africa. Because even when the poetry is not written by an African, as far as or as long as the poetry is about Africa, then it is African poetry. It qualifies to be called African poetry. So then you could say that African poetry is a type of poetry that is written by an African poet or non-African poet, but which talks about Africa, or is about Africa, or describes African sensibilities. Generally in literature, when a work of art is about Africa, then it qualifies to be African, whether the work is written by an African or not. The sensibilities of the literature is what makes the literature identified with a particular group. Apart from that, there are other things that make African poetry African, or that qualify African poetry to have its own name. Now, this qualifier, African, is also necessary in order to set African poetry apart from poetry from other places, like America, like Europe, and Asia. But then, there's need for justification on why you have that marker, that identity marker and qualifier. And I said one is authorship. One is authorship. If the author is from Africa, then what the author writes is going to pass for African poetry. Second, if the poem is, or if the poetry is about Africa, even if the author is not from Africa, then the poetry can still be called African poetry. The third thing that qualifies poetry to be called African would be the themes, thematic concerns of the poem. The thematic concerns of the poem are also important in ascribing identity, African identity to the poem. For instance, if the themes are germane to Africa, that are distinctively African themes, then the poems would be called African poetry. And we are going to discuss such themes as we go along on the course. By that I mean, if the issues raised in the work are issues that are relevant to Africa, then they qualify the poems to be African poetry. Then you can also talk about the style. The style of writing is also important. And this is so because African poetry has its unique tone, unique style, which is drawn from orature. It's drawn from orature. Orature provides the raw material for the writing of African poetry. This is very important because when you want to discuss African poetry, you have to remember its origins. It is that origin that gave African poetry its distinctive identity. And the origin is rooted in orature. Orature is spelled O-R-A-T-U-R-E. Orature. O-R-A-T-U-R-E. Orature. A kind of literature that is not written down, but is passed on from generation to generation through the words of the mouth. Generally speaking, when you want to discuss African literature, you have to understand that African literature has its origin in African oral tradition. Our stories, our folk tales, our songs, our dances, passed down from generation to generation by ancestors. The idea of oral is because they were not written down. They existed in the memory of the people and were handed down through oral transfer. So, if you studied oral literature, you will notice that you would have been introduced to aspects of poetry, aspects of grammar, and aspects of prose in oral literature. So, aspects of poetry would include songs, chants, proverbs, tongue twisters. These are oral forms of poetry. Now, what you need to understand is that when the modern African poets began writing, they based their material or they drew their material from the oral traditions, these oral aspects of poetry, African poetry. So when you read modern African poetry, and by modern African poetry, we refer to poetry that is written down, poetry that's written. So you can contrast between modern African poetry and oral poetry, poetry in the oral tradition. So what makes African poetry distinctively African is that its main material, its raw material, is drawn from oral tradition. I mentioned some aspects of it, like our songs, our chants, proverbs, tongue twisters, and so on and so forth. So that even when you are reading modern African poetry, that is the poetry that is written down, you will notice that these oral forms persist in the poems. The oral forms persist in the poem. And so when you're discussing African poetry and why it is African, you need to remember that the basic raw material used in the writing of modern African poetry comes from the oral tradition. So when we begin to read some of our poems, I would like to ask you to identify aspects of oral poetry or oral tradition in the poems. Because those are the things that make the poem distinctively African. Then setting of the poem is also important. The setting of the poem is also important. We talked about oral tradition, we talk about setting. When you read modern African poetry, you will notice a conscious attempt to depict the African environment. The environment is part of the sensibilities. So it's important that the poet draw from the environment, from the environment that's distinctively African. Because in such poetry, you'll come across our hills, our forests, our flora and fauna, our mud houses, our thatched roofs, our birds, our rivers, our streams. You'll come across African sights and sounds. You can pick up an African poem and say, or a set of African poems, and say you want to study the sights and sounds of the poem because they are distinctively African, or what makes the poem or the poems African. So you can study our African sights and sounds, African poetry. The African space depicted even in modern African poetry is distinctively African. It's unique, as I've mentioned. You look like, read a poem like Piano and Drum, a poem like The Cathedral, a poem like Africa. For instance, the poems of Africa, My Africa, Africa of path, warriors in ancestral savannah. Has distinctively African environment being depicted. Fat warriors in ancestral savannah. And that depicts the expression that depicts our pre-colonial environment. And the type of human beings that lived there. There were warriors. There were no mean men. There were no cowards. So there's that conscious attempt to depict the pre-colonial setting in modern African poetry in order to retain the African identity in African poetry. That's all you need to know. So this is setting is very important. Because that's what makes the poem distinctively African. Then we can talk about cultural ethos. Cultural ethos. Then talk about cultural ethos. Cultural ethos. One of the things that give African poetry its distinctive identity is a depiction of African cultural ethos in the poem. Depiction of African cultural ethos in the poem. African mores, African tradition, African mores, African tradition, African cultural values are usually captured in modern African poetry to retain the African identity marks in this poem. Values like hard work, bravery,